The crystal chandelier cast shadows across the mahogany dining table as my cousin Marcus raised his wine glass, grinning at the assembled family. "Here's to another successful year at Goldman Sachs," he announced, his voice carrying that particular blend of pride and condescension I'd grown to despise. "Some of us are really making the family name shine. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss." His eyes found mine across the table, that familiar smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. The kind of look that said everything without saying anything at all. The kind that reminded me exactly where I stood in the pecking order of the Rodriguez family hierarchy. I gripped my water glass tighter, forcing my expression to remain neutral. Around the table, aunts and uncles nodded approvingly, murmuring congratulations. My brother Diego beamed from his seat beside Marcus, fresh from his promotion to senior partner at his law firm. Even my sister Carmen, usually the quiet one, was glowing as she discussed her latest real estate deals. And then there was me, Maya Rodriguez, the family disappointment. The one who never quite figured it out. The 32-year-old woman who still couldn't give a straight answer when relatives asked what exactly she did for work. If only they knew that in 12 hours I'd be briefing the Joint Chiefs of Staff on a situation that could determine the fate of 3 captured American soldiers halfway around the world. The Rodriguez family had always been about visible success. My grandfather, Eduardo Rodriguez, had built a construction empire from nothing, his calloused hands laying the foundation for what would become Rodriguez & Sons development. Every brick in our family's suburban Chicago mansion told the story of his American dream realized through sweat and determination. The tradition continued through my father, Antonio Rodriguez, who expanded the business into commercial real estate and city contracts. By the time I was old enough to understand money, our name was on half the buildings downtown. Success, in our family, was measured in square footage, profit margins, and how prominently your achievements could be displayed at Sunday dinner. My mother, Isabella, had been the perfect complement to this empire. Former Miss Illinois runner-up, she'd traded her crown for a role as the family's social architect. Every charity gala, every political fundraiser, every strategic dinner party that elevated the Rodriguez name bore her fingerprints. She moved through Chicago's elite circles like she was born to them, which, in many ways, she was. The blueprint was clear. Rodriguez children were destined for greatness, but only the kind of greatness that could be easily explained at cocktail parties. Law, finance, real estate, politics. These were acceptable paths. These were careers that looked good in Christmas newsletters and generated the right kind of newspaper mentions. From the moment I could walk, I was different. While Diego played with toy bulldozers and Carmen set up elaborate dollhouse real estate offices, I was in the corner with a map and a magnifying glass, trying to figure out why certain countries were shaped the way they were. I asked questions that made adults uncomfortable. Why were some places crossed out in Dad's atlas? What did the red pins on his office wall map actually mean? Why did certain phone calls make him lower his voice and switch to Spanish? By age 8, I was fluent in 3 languages: Spanish from home, French from an immersion program, and bits of Arabic I'd picked up from our neighbor, Mrs. Khalil, who taught me while we gardened together. My parents saw it as cute, a quirky hobby that would eventually give way to more practical interests. "Maya's got such an imagination," my mother would tell her bridge club friends, the phrase carrying just enough affection to mask the underlying concern. "She's always asking about places none of us have ever heard of." The concern became more pronounced as I got older. While other teenagers were focused on homecoming dances and college applications, I spent hours in the public library reading about geopolitics and international relations. I memorized the organizational structures of foreign governments, studied economic patterns in emerging markets, and could recite the recent history of border disputes in regions most Americans couldn't locate on a map. My bedroom walls, instead of being covered with boy band posters like Carmen's, were decorated with maps. Not pretty decorative ones, but serious topographical and political maps, marked with colored pins and string connections that looked like something from a conspiracy theorist's garage. I tracked political movements, economic indicators, and what I later learned were early warning signs of regional instability. It's not normal, I overheard my father telling my mother one evening when they thought I was asleep. 16-year-old girls shouldn't know the names of cabinet ministers in countries we can't even pronounce. She's just intellectual, Antonio, my mother replied, but her voice carried doubt. Maybe she'll become a teacher, history or geography or something stable. The word stable became their code for my future. Not successful, not ambitious, not brilliant, just stable. It was as if they'd already decided I was destined for mediocrity, and were simply hoping to manage the disappointment. The breaking point came during my senior year of high school. I'd been accepted to Northwestern with a partial scholarship, planning to study international relations. Diego was already at Harvard Law, the pride of the family, and Carmen had just gotten engaged to a promising young banker. The family success story was writing itself perfectly, except for one chapter that didn't quite fit. At the dinner table, where I'd later face their collective judgment as an adult, my father made an announcement that changed everything. He was expanding Rodriguez & Sons into international markets, specifically focusing on development projects in Latin America. It was a massive undertaking, requiring partnerships with foreign governments and navigation of complex regulatory environments. This is going to be the biggest thing our family has ever done, he said, his eyes bright with ambition. Diego, once you finish law school, you'll handle the legal side. Carmen, your fiancé's banking connections will be crucial for the financing. He turned to me, and for a moment I felt a flutter of hope. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was where my strange obsessions would finally make sense to them. And Maya, he continued, you can help with the administrative side. Translation work, maybe some basic research. Your language skills might actually come in handy for once. Administrative side, translation work, basic research. I felt something crack inside my chest. Here was a project that seemed tailor-made for everything I'd been studying, everything I'd been preparing for without even knowing it, and I was being offered the role of office assistant. Actually, Dad, I said carefully, I've been thinking I might want to study international security. Maybe work in government consulting, or... The laughter around the table cut me off. Not cruel laughter, but the kind of gentle, dismissive chuckling reserved for children who announce they want to be astronauts or presidents. Security? Marcus, my cousin who was visiting from college, grinned. Like, what, becoming a mall cop? That's not what international security means, I replied, my voice tighter than I intended. It's about analyzing global threats, understanding geopolitical risks, helping prevent conflicts before they... Honey, my mother interrupted, her voice carrying that particular tone of maternal patience. Those kinds of jobs are for people with connections. Family connections in Washington, political backgrounds. We're business people. Besides, my father added, cutting into his steak with deliberate precision, government work doesn't pay well. You'd struggle to maintain the lifestyle you're used to. The lifestyle I was used to. As if I'd ever been motivated by money or status symbols. As if the hours I spent studying global economics and political theory were some kind of expensive hobby rather than a genuine calling. What if I'm good at it? I asked, the question coming out smaller than I'd intended. My uncle Roberto, Dad's younger brother and business partner, smiled indulgently. Maya, sweetheart, being good at something and making a living at it are two different things. Your fascination with world affairs is admirable, but it's not practical. Stick with something solid, something you can build a real career on. That night, I lay in bed staring at my map-covered walls and realized something fundamental. My family didn't just doubt my abilities, they couldn't even see them. To them, my passion for understanding the world was an eccentricity to be tolerated, not a strength to be cultivated. I made a decision that would shape the next 14 years of my life. If they couldn't see who I really was, then I'd become invisible to them in every way that mattered. I'd pursue my real calling, but I'd do it so quietly, so completely separate from their world, that they'd never have to confront the possibility that they'd been wrong about me all along. I'd let them believe I was exactly who they thought I was, right up until the moment when the truth became impossible to ignore. The acceptance letter from Northwestern arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, thick and cream-colored with the university's seal embossed in deep purple. I held it in my hands for a full minute before opening it, knowing that whatever was inside would determine not just my next 4 years but the trajectory of my entire life. Full scholarship, international studies program, dean's recommendation for accelerated coursework. I should have been ecstatic. Instead, I felt a hollow sensation in my stomach as I imagined the conversation I'd have to have at dinner that night. The polite congratulations that would mask their fundamental inability to understand why anyone would choose such an impractical path. That evening played out exactly as I'd predicted. The family gathered around the dining table, the same mahogany surface where years later I'd face their collective judgment as an adult. My father carved the roast beef with mechanical precision, while my mother distributed sides with the efficiency of someone who'd perfected the art of family dinner choreography. Maya has some news, my mother announced, her voice carrying that particular blend of pride and apprehension that had become her default tone when discussing my academic choices. I cleared my throat, holding the letter like a shield. I got into Northwestern, full scholarship for international studies. The responses came in waves. Diego, home from Harvard for spring break, nodded approvingly. Northwestern's a good school, solid reputation. Carmen smiled genuinely, always the supportive sister. That's amazing, Maya. You worked so hard for this. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. But it was my father's reaction that mattered most, and his silence stretched across the table like a fault line. He set down his carving knife, wiped his hands on his napkin, and looked at me with the expression of a man calculating a business loss. International studies, he repeated, the words sitting heavy between us. And what exactly does one do with a degree in international studies? The question hung in the air. I'd prepared for this moment, had rehearsed my answer dozens of times, but under his gaze, my carefully constructed arguments felt suddenly flimsy. There are lots of options, I began. Diplomatic service, international business consulting, policy analysis for think tanks, intelligence work. Intelligence work? My uncle Roberto, who'd joined us for dinner, nearly choked on his wine. What is this, a James Bond movie? The laughter that followed wasn't malicious, but it was dismissive in a way that cut deeper than outright cruelty. They weren't trying to hurt me. They simply couldn't conceive of a world where their daughter, their niece, their little Maya, who used to play with maps in her bedroom, could be involved in anything truly significant. Those kinds of jobs, my father said slowly, require connections we don't have. Political families, military backgrounds, people who've been in Washington for generations. We're business people, Maya. We build things. We create jobs. We deal in concrete realities, not theoretical policies. But what if? I started. What if what? His voice carried the weight of finality. What if you spend 4 years studying something that sounds impressive but leads nowhere? What if you graduate with a degree that qualifies you for entry-level positions at nonprofits that pay less than our receptionists make? The silence that followed was suffocating. Around the table, I could see the unspoken consensus forming. They loved me, but they'd already written my story, and it was one of well-intentioned failure followed by eventual surrender to practical considerations. There's still time to change your major, my mother said gently. Business administration, maybe, or communications, something versatile. Versatile. Another code word, like stable. Something that would allow me to eventually find my way back to the family business without too much damage to anyone's expectations. That night, I sat in my room surrounded by my maps and felt something fundamental shift inside me. I'd reached a crossroads, and the path my family wanted me to take led to a version of myself I couldn't recognize, someone who'd given up her deepest curiosity about the world in exchange for their approval. I made a decision that would shape everything that followed. I would go to Northwestern, but I wouldn't just study international relations, I would excel at it. I would pursue every opportunity, every connection, every chance to prove that my instincts about the world were not just valid but valuable. And I would do it all while maintaining the fiction that I was following their practical advice. The next morning, I called the Northwestern admissions office and asked about dual enrollment possibilities. Could I officially major in business administration while taking a full course load in international studies? The advisor seemed confused but confirmed it was possible, though it would mean an incredibly demanding schedule. Perfect. I would give my family the major they wanted to see on my transcripts, while building the expertise I knew I needed. For the next 4 years, I would live a double life so complete that even I sometimes forgot which version was real. My freshman year began with a carefully orchestrated deception. When my parents dropped me off at Northwestern, my official schedule showed Introduction to Macroeconomics, Business Statistics, and Marketing Fundamentals. What they didn't see was my real schedule: Advanced International Security Studies, Comparative Government Systems, and a seminar on intelligence analysis taught by a professor who'd spent 20 years at the State Department. The workload was crushing. While my roommate complained about having 3 classes, I was managing 7, attending 2 different sets of study groups, and writing papers for professors who didn't know each other existed. I slept 4 hours a night and lived on coffee and determination. But something magical happened in those international studies classes. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who shared my fascination with global affairs. My professors didn't just tolerate my questions about geopolitical strategy and threat assessment, they encouraged them. They pushed me harder, gave me additional readings, and began treating me less like a student and more like a junior colleague. Dr. Patricia Hartwell, who taught the Intelligence Analysis seminar, was the first person to see my potential clearly. She was a small woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, someone who'd spent decades analyzing threats to American interests from behind closed doors in Washington. On a Thursday afternoon in October, she asked me to stay after class. "Miss Rodriguez," she said, organizing her papers with military precision, "I've been reviewing your work. Your analysis of the political situation in Venezuela was remarkably sophisticated. Have you considered applying for summer internships in Washington?" My heart jumped. "What kind of internships?" "The kind that require security clearances," she said, meeting my eyes directly. "The kind that might interest someone with your particular talents for pattern recognition and strategic thinking." I felt as if she'd just offered me access to a secret world I'd only imagined existed. I don't have any connections in Washington. My family doesn't know anyone in the government. Dr. Hartwell smiled, and for the first time, it didn't feel like the indulgent expression adults usually wore when discussing my interests. Connections help, but they're not everything. Talent is rarer than people think, and based on your work, you have talent. That conversation changed everything. Dr. Hartwell became my mentor, introducing me to a network of former intelligence officers who'd transitioned into academia. She recommended me for a summer program at Georgetown that focused on threat assessment and strategic planning. She helped me understand that the career I dreamed of wasn't just possible, it was necessary. But the more deeply I dove into this world, the wider the gap grew between who I was becoming and who my family thought I was. During winter break, they asked about my classes, and I found myself describing marketing case studies instead of the counterterrorism simulation I'd actually spent the semester working on. When they asked about my friends, I talked about business students rather than the former Army intelligence officer who'd become my study partner. The deception wasn't malicious, but it was complete. I was building a parallel life, one where my passion for understanding global threats was not just validated, but cultivated. In that world, I wasn't the dreamy girl who played with maps. I was someone whose insights mattered, whose analysis could influence real decisions. By the end of my freshman year, I knew with absolute certainty that I would never be coming back to work in the family business. I would never be satisfied translating documents or doing basic research for Rodriguez & Sons development. I was meant for something bigger, something that my family couldn't even imagine. The question wasn't whether I had the ability to succeed in international security. My professors had already confirmed that I did. The question was whether I had the courage to pursue a path that would inevitably lead me away from everything my family understood about success and achievement. That summer, as I prepared for my first real internship in Washington, I made a promise to myself. I would stop asking for their approval and start building something that deserved it, whether they ever understood it or not. The Georgetown summer program felt like stepping through a portal into a world that existed parallel to the one I'd always known. The orientation took place in a nondescript building near DuPont Circle, the kind of place you'd walk past 100 times without noticing. Inside, 35 students from universities across the country gathered in a windowless conference room that smelled of coffee and ambition. Dr. Rebecca Mitchell, the program director, stood at the front of the room with the bearing of someone who'd spent decades making decisions that never appeared in newspapers. Her introduction was brief and pointed. For the next 10 weeks, you'll be exposed to real-world intelligence scenarios. Some of you will discover you're not cut out for this work. Others will find their calling. Both outcomes are valuable. The coursework was unlike anything I'd experienced at Northwestern. We analyzed actual case studies from the Cuban Missile Crisis, dissected intelligence failures that led to major international incidents, and participated in simulations that felt uncomfortably real. My classmates came from military families, political dynasties, and academic legacies that traced back to the founding of American intelligence services. And then there was me, the daughter of a Chicago real estate developer who'd stumbled into this world through sheer determination and Dr. Hartwell's recommendation. The first major test came during week 3. We were given a scenario. Intelligence assets in Eastern Europe had reported unusual military movements along a disputed border. Communications intercepts suggested an imminent military action, but the signals were contradictory and incomplete. We had 48 hours to provide a threat assessment and recommend a course of action. While my classmates formed study groups and divided up research tasks, I found myself working alone in the library until 3 a.m, cross-referencing historical precedents with current economic indicators. Something about the pattern felt familiar, like a puzzle I'd been unconsciously preparing to solve my entire life. My analysis diverged sharply from the consensus. Where others saw preparation for military escalation, I identified an elaborate economic manipulation designed to influence commodity prices. The military movements, I argued, were theater, designed to create the appearance of instability, while the real objective was market manipulation that would benefit specific corporate interests. When Dr. Mitchell called me to her office after our presentations, I was certain I'd failed spectacularly. Instead, she set a file on her desk and studied me with the intensity of someone conducting an interrogation. "Miss Rodriguez," she said finally, "your analysis was the only one that correctly identified the actual threat. The scenario you just worked through? It happened 18 months ago. Every one of your classmates fell for the same misdirection that fooled 3 different intelligence agencies. How did you see what they missed?" I fumbled for an explanation. "I don't know, it just seemed the economic indicators didn't match the military timeline, and the pattern reminded me of something I'd read about market manipulation during the Asian financial crisis." She nodded slowly. "Have you considered that pattern recognition might be more than just an academic strength for you?" That conversation led to my first real assignment. Not a simulation, but actual analytical work for a government contractor. The project involved tracking financial flows that might indicate funding for terrorist organizations. It was entry-level work, essentially data entry with a security clearance, but it was real. For the rest of that summer, I lived 2 completely different lives. During the day, I worked in a secure facility in Arlington, analyzing banking records and creating reports that disappeared into classified channels. My evenings were spent in coffee shops around Georgetown, video calling my family and pretending I was doing marketing research for a consulting firm. "How's the internship going?" my mother would ask, her face pixelated on my laptop screen. "Really well," I'd reply, which was true. "I'm learning a lot about data analysis and report writing." Also true, just not in the way she imagined. The hardest part wasn't the deception. It was the isolation. I couldn't share my excitement when my analysis helped identify a suspicious financial network. I couldn't explain why I was working late when my supervisor asked me to dig deeper into a pattern I'd identified. I couldn't tell anyone that for the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. The summer ended with individual evaluations. Dr. Mitchell handed me an envelope marked confidential and told me not to open it until I was alone. Back in my dorm room, I broke the seal with trembling fingers. "Miss Rodriguez demonstrates exceptional analytical capabilities and natural instincts for intelligence work. Her pattern recognition skills are among the strongest I've observed in 15 years of program administration. I recommend her for advanced placement in our selective pipeline program upon graduation." Attached was information about something called the Presidential Management Fellows Program, a fast-track pathway into senior government positions that typically led to assignments in intelligence agencies. The acceptance rate was less than 2%. I stared at the papers until the words blurred. This was real. This was possible. The career I'd dreamed of wasn't just accessible, it was being offered to me. But first, I had to survive the next 3 years of college while maintaining the fiction that I was preparing for a conventional business career. Returning to Northwestern that fall was jarring. After a summer of analyzing real threats and working with professionals who understood the stakes of global security, sitting through Introduction to Corporate Finance felt like playing house. My business administration classmates discussed internships at banks and consulting firms while I mentally calculated how to maintain my GPA in courses that felt increasingly irrelevant. The solution was to become invisible in plain sight. I attended every business class, participated just enough to avoid notice, and earned solid B's that satisfied my parents without drawing attention. But my real energy went into the international studies courses that I'd officially dropped but continued auditing. Dr. Hartwell became more than a mentor. She became my lifeline to the world I was preparing to enter. She arranged for me to take graduate-level courses, connected me with visiting professors from Washington think tanks, and helped me access research databases that most undergraduates never saw. "You're walking a difficult path," she told me during one of our regular coffee meetings. "Living authentically while maintaining family relationships that depend on their illusions about who you are. It takes a particular kind of strength." The strength was tested repeatedly. During sophomore year, my father visited campus unexpectedly, hoping to take me to lunch and meet some of my professors. I had exactly 15 minutes to construct an elaborate story about why my favorite business professor was unavailable, while quickly arranging for Dr. Hartwell to pretend she was teaching a required economics course rather than advanced threat assessment. The conversation over lunch was excruciating. My father talked enthusiastically about Rodriguez and Sons' expansion plans, assuming I was absorbing every detail for my eventual role in the company. He described properties they were developing, contracts they were pursuing, and the leadership position he envisioned for me after graduation. "You'll start in project management," he explained, cutting into his steak with the same methodical precision I remembered from childhood dinners. "Learn the business from the ground up. In 5 years, you could be running your own division." I nodded and smiled, playing the role of the dutiful daughter while privately calculating how to explain my eventual career choice in a way that wouldn't destroy him. The deception deepened during my junior year when I was selected for a semester abroad program, officially studying international business in London, actually completing an intensive intelligence training course at a facility outside the city. For 4 months, I learned tradecraft techniques, practiced surveillance detection, and participated in exercises that simulated real intelligence operations. My letters home described cultural experiences and business case studies, while I was actually learning how to spot hostile surveillance and assess human intelligence sources. I sent photos of myself at tourist attractions, while spending my days in classrooms that looked more like bunkers than lecture halls. The program culminated in a final exercise that felt more like an audition than a test. Working in teams of 3, we were tasked with gathering intelligence on a simulated terrorist cell operating in London. The scenario was complex, involving multiple false identities, surveillance operations, and source development. My team's success rate was unprecedented. We not only identified all the primary targets, but uncovered a secondary network that the exercise designers hadn't expected anyone to find. Our instructor, a former MI6 officer, pulled me aside afterward. "Miss Rodriguez, have you given thought to which agency you'd like to work for after graduation?" The question took my breath away. Not whether I'd work in intelligence, but which agency. The assumption that I belonged in this world was the validation I'd been seeking my entire life. But as I flew back to Chicago for winter break, I felt the weight of the gap I'd created between my 2 lives. At home, I would once again become Maya, the business student, the daughter who was finally getting practical about her future. The family that greeted me at O'Hare had no idea that their supposedly unremarkable daughter had just completed training that qualified her for some of the most classified positions in the U.S. government. That Christmas dinner, I sat at the familiar mahogany table and listened to updates about Diego's law career and Carmen's real estate success, while hiding the knowledge that I'd spent the last semester learning skills they couldn't imagine. When my uncle Roberto asked about my studies, I described supply chain management courses while thinking about the counterterrorism methods I'd actually been learning. The hardest part wasn't the lying. It was the growing certainty that eventually, The truth would have to come out, and when it did, everything would change forever. Senior year brought a development I hadn't anticipated, my first real assignment while still officially a college student. The call came on a Tuesday evening in September from a number I didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end belonged to someone from my London program. Ms. Rodriguez, this is Agent Sarah Chen with the Defense Intelligence Agency. We have a situation that could benefit from your particular analytical skills. Are you available for a consultation this weekend? A consultation. At 21 years old, while my classmates were stressing about job interviews and graduation parties, I was being asked to consult on actual intelligence matters. The assignment was classified, requiring me to fly to Washington under the cover of visiting graduate schools. I told my roommate I was interviewing at Georgetown's MBA program and caught a Friday evening flight to Reagan National. The briefing took place in a conference room that could have belonged to any corporate office building, except for the complete absence of windows and the fact that everyone's phones were locked in a metal box by the door. The situation was more complex than anything I'd encountered in training. Intelligence assets had reported unusual financial transfers from legitimate businesses to accounts linked with known terrorist sympathizers. The amounts were small enough to avoid automatic flagging, but the pattern suggested something larger was developing. 3 different agencies have looked at this, Agent Chen explained, spreading documents across the table. Treasury thinks it's standard money laundering. FBI suspects it's funding for domestic operations. We think both agencies are missing something bigger. She slid a folder toward me. You have 48 hours to tell us what we're not seeing. For the next 2 days, I lived in that windowless room, surviving on vending machine coffee and the sandwiches Agent Chen brought at irregular intervals. I built timeline charts that covered every wall, tracked financial flows through a dozen countries, and cross-referenced the transfers with everything from weather patterns to political events. The breakthrough came at 3 a.m. on Sunday. The transfers weren't funding operations. They were creating them. Someone was deliberately establishing small financial relationships that could later be activated as funding channels. It was infrastructure building, not operational funding. The real threat wasn't what was happening now, but what could happen in 18 months when these dormant networks came online. When I presented my analysis that afternoon, the room fell silent. Agent Chen studied my charts for several minutes before looking up with an expression I couldn't read. Ms. Rodriguez, you've identified a pattern that completely changes our threat assessment. This suggests a level of long-term planning we hadn't considered. She paused, glancing at her colleagues. How would you like to continue working on this? The offer was unprecedented. While finishing my senior year at Northwestern, I would also work as a part-time analyst for the DIA, flying to Washington every other weekend to contribute to ongoing investigations. It meant living an even more elaborate double life, but it also meant doing work that mattered in ways I'd only dreamed about. The logistics were overwhelming. My official schedule showed a senior project on international marketing strategies, but my real work involved analyzing terrorist financing networks across 3 continents. I attended graduation rehearsals while carrying a classified phone that could ring at any moment with updates on global threats. The hardest part was the isolation. I couldn't share my excitement when my analysis helped prevent a major financial operation. I couldn't explain to my study group why I missed meetings. I was in Washington briefing intelligence officials. Wasn't exactly an acceptable excuse. I couldn't even celebrate properly when my work contributed to dismantling a network that could have funded attacks across Europe. Instead, I smiled politely when classmates complained about their senior projects while privately knowing I was working on investigations that could influence international security policy. The pressure intensified during spring semester when my family began asking detailed questions about my post-graduation plans. Rodriguez and Sons was expanding faster than anticipated, and my father had been telling business associates about his daughter who would soon join the company's international division. We're breaking ground on 3 new projects in Mexico next year, he announced during one of our weekly phone calls. Your language skills and business background make you perfect for overseeing those operations. I gripped the phone tighter, staring at the classified analysis spread across my dorm room desk. On my computer screen was a threat assessment regarding Central American organized crime that I'd be presenting to senior DIA officials the following morning. My father was offering me a project management role, while I was simultaneously tracking international security threats that could affect the very regions where Rodriguez and Sons planned to expand. That sounds exciting, Dad. I managed, my voice steady despite the surreal nature of the conversation. Can we talk about the details after graduation? The truth was, I'd already received 2 job offers that made my father's plans irrelevant. The CIA wanted me for their analytical division, and the State Department had offered a position in their Bureau of Intelligence and Research. Both came with security clearances that would make my actual work invisible to anyone outside the intelligence community. But accepting either offer would mean revealing everything to my family, and I wasn't ready for that conversation. The solution came from an unexpected source. Dr. Hartwell, who'd been tracking my unusual senior year through our regular coffee meetings, suggested a transitional approach. What if you accepted a position with a consulting firm that does government contracting work, she proposed. You could tell your family you're working in international business consulting while actually doing intelligence analysis. It's not deception exactly, it's just selective disclosure. The firm she recommended, Strategic Analysis International, was perfect for my needs. Officially, they provided business intelligence and risk assessment for multinational corporations. Unofficially, they were a major contractor for various intelligence agencies, providing analytical support on projects too sensitive for direct government employment. The interview process was unlike anything my classmates experienced. Instead of discussing quarterly projections and market strategies, I found myself in a secure facility outside Washington, analyzing real-time intelligence data while senior analysts evaluated my methodology. Dr. James Patterson, SAI's Director of Operations, was a former CIA Deputy Director who'd spent 30 years in intelligence analysis. After reviewing my work, he made an offer that solved all my immediate problems. "We'd like you to join our International Risk Assessment Division," he said, sliding a contract across his desk. "You'll be analyzing political and economic stability in regions where our corporate clients are considering investments. Your official title will be Senior Risk Analyst, but your actual work will involve intelligence analysis on behalf of government clients." The salary was substantial enough to satisfy my family's expectations, while the work was exactly what I'd been training for. Most importantly, I could describe my job in terms they'd understand and approve of, without revealing the classified nature of my actual responsibilities. Graduation day arrived with a complexity of emotions I hadn't anticipated. Sitting in my cap and gown, surrounded by classmates who were celebrating the end of their academic careers, I felt like I was attending someone else's ceremony. They were graduating into entry-level positions with clearly defined career paths. I was stepping into a world where my actual job description couldn't be printed on business cards. My family's pride was overwhelming and heartbreaking. My parents beamed as I walked across the stage, convinced they were watching their daughter finally embrace a practical career path. Diego and Carmen hugged me with genuine affection, excited about my consulting position and the possibility that I might eventually return to help with Rodriguez and Sons' international expansion. "We're so proud of you for finding something practical," my mother whispered as we posed for photos after the ceremony. "International business consulting. That's perfect for someone with your interests." If only she knew that within a month, I'd be briefing senior officials on threats to American interests in the same regions where Rodriguez and Sons was planning to build shopping centers. The celebration dinner that night was bittersweet. Around the table where I'd later face their collective judgment as an adult, my family toasted my future in international business consulting while I silently celebrated my acceptance into a world they couldn't imagine. They raised their glasses to Maya, the practical consultant, while I was becoming someone entirely different, someone whose work would matter in ways they might never understand. But for the first time, I didn't feel guilty about the deception. I'd found my calling, and I was about to pursue it with everything I had. Whether they ever understood it or not, I was finally becoming exactly who I was meant to be. 5 years into my career at Strategic Analysis International, I had become someone my family couldn't recognize, even though they saw me regularly. To them, I was Maya, the business consultant, who traveled frequently for client meetings and worked on projects too boring to discuss in detail. In reality, I was Senior Intelligence Analyst Maya Rodriguez, whose threat assessments influenced policy decisions at the highest levels of government. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Each year had brought deeper assignments, higher clearances, and greater responsibility. What started as part-time analytical work had evolved into leading a team of 12 analysts who provided intelligence support to operations across 4 continents. My official business cards still read Senior Risk Analyst, but my actual work involved briefing cabinet-level officials on emerging global threats. The success came with a price. The gap between my 2 lives had grown so wide that I sometimes felt like I was suffering from professional amnesia. During family dinners, I would nod politely as my relatives discussed their straightforward careers, while mentally reviewing classified briefings about international kidnapping networks or emerging terrorist threats. The stress of constant deception was compounded by professional pressure I couldn't share with anyone. In March of my 5th year, I was assigned to lead the analysis of a situation that would define my career. 3 American journalists had been kidnapped while covering political unrest in a country I can't name, and intelligence suggested they were being held by a group with connections to several international terrorist organizations. The case was extraordinarily complex. The kidnappers were demanding the release of political prisoners in exchange for the hostages. But intelligence indicated their real goal was forcing the U.S. government into a public negotiation that would legitimize their organization. My job was to analyze all available intelligence and provide recommendations for a rescue operation. For 6 weeks, I worked 18-hour days, coordinating with analysts from multiple agencies while maintaining my cover as a business consultant. When my mother called to chat, I would step away from satellite imagery and hostage movement analysis to discuss her garden and ask about Carmen's latest real estate deals. The breakthrough came when I identified a pattern in the kidnappers' communications that revealed the location where the hostages were being held. But more importantly, my analysis suggested that a rescue operation had to happen within a specific 48-hour window, or the hostages would be moved to a location where extraction would be nearly impossible. The briefing took place in a secure facility beneath the Pentagon, with representatives from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, CIA, and State Department present. Standing at the front of that room, presenting an analysis that could determine whether 3 Americans lived or died, I felt the full weight of the career I'd chosen. Based on communication intercepts and movement patterns, I explained, indicating locations on a detailed map, the hostages are currently being held in this compound. However, our sources indicate they'll be moved to a more remote location within 48 hours. This represents our optimal window for extraction. General Patricia Williams, the deputy chairman of the Joint Chiefs, studied my analysis intently. Miss Rodriguez, what's your confidence level in this assessment? 93%, ma'am. The pattern recognition algorithms I developed specifically for tracking hostage movements show consistent indicators pointing to this location and timeline. The rescue operation was authorized that afternoon. 36 hours later, all 3 hostages were safely extracted in an operation that lasted 17 minutes and resulted in no American casualties. It was the kind of success that would never appear in newspapers, but it represented the pinnacle of everything I'd worked toward. But that same week, my professional triumph collided with a personal crisis in a way that finally forced me to confront the impossible situation I'd created. The family crisis began with a phone call from Carmen on a Thursday evening. She was crying, which was unusual enough to immediately grab my attention. Maya, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. My stomach dropped. Had someone discovered my real work? Had my cover somehow been compromised? What's wrong? I asked, my mind already calculating damage control scenarios. It's about Mom, Carmen said, her voice shaking. She's been having chest pains for weeks, but she won't see a doctor. She says it's stress about the business, but Dad's worried it might be her heart. Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by guilt. While I'd been focused on international crises, my own mother had been suffering, and I'd been too distracted by classified briefings to notice. Why didn't anyone tell me sooner? I asked. We tried, Carmen replied, and I could hear the accusation in her voice. You've been impossible to reach lately. Always traveling, always in meetings. When's the last time you actually had a real conversation with any of us? The question hit like a physical blow. I realized that in my efforts to maintain the fiction of my consulting career, I'd gradually withdrawn from my family entirely. My phone calls had become perfunctory check-ins, my visits brief and distracted. I'd been so focused on hiding my real work that I'd stopped participating in their lives altogether. "I'll come home this weekend," I said immediately. "I'll talk to her." But even as I made the promise, I knew it was complicated. The hostage situation was still developing, and I was scheduled to brief the National Security Council on Monday morning about the ongoing investigation into the kidnapping network. Stepping away from that work, even for a family emergency, meant potentially compromising operations that affected American lives. For the first time in 5 years, I was faced with a choice between my professional obligations and my family responsibilities, and I couldn't explain to them why the choice was so difficult. The weekend home was revealing in ways I hadn't expected. My mother did look tired, more fragile than I'd noticed during my brief visits. But what struck me more was how little I knew about their current lives. Diego was considering a career change that I knew nothing about. Carmen was going through relationship problems she'd apparently been discussing with everyone except me. My parents were dealing with financial pressures related to the business expansion that I'd been too distracted to notice. I'd become a stranger in my own family while believing I was protecting them from a truth they couldn't handle. The confrontation came Sunday evening as I was preparing to return to Washington for the NSC briefing. My father asked to speak with me privately in his study, the same room where I'd first shown him my childhood fascination with maps and codes. "Maya," he began, settling into his leather chair with the weariness of someone carrying invisible burdens, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." The similarity to Carmen's words 2 days earlier wasn't lost on me. "Are you in some kind of trouble?" he asked. "Financial problems, maybe? Legal issues? Because the way you've been acting lately, distant, secretive, always rushing off to mysterious meetings, it's not like you." I stared at him, this man who'd spent my entire childhood dismissing my interests and ambitions, now worried that my success was actually failure in disguise. The irony was devastating. "I'm not in trouble, Dad," I said carefully. "My work is just demanding." "What kind of consulting work requires this level of secrecy?" he pressed. "You never talk about your clients. You can't tell us where you're traveling. You get phone calls at all hours that you have to take in private. It sounds like you're either working for criminals or you're lying to us about what you actually do." The accusation hung between us like a challenge. For a moment, I considered telling him everything about the intelligence work, the briefings, the classified operations that had shaped the last 5 years of my life. But I could also imagine his reaction: disbelief, followed by fear, followed by the inevitable conclusion that his daughter had somehow been deceived into a career that was either imaginary or dangerous. Instead, I chose a middle path that I immediately regretted. "You're right that my work is more complex than I've explained," I said slowly. "But it's not what you're worried about. I can't discuss the details because of confidentiality agreements with my clients." He studied my face with the intensity of someone who'd spent decades reading people in business negotiations. "Maya, I love you, but I don't believe you. Something is going on, and until you're ready to tell us the truth, I think you should stay away from family gatherings. Your mother doesn't need the stress of worrying about whatever you're hiding." The words hit like a physical blow. I was being banished from my own family for refusing to reveal work that I couldn't discuss without violating federal law. The choice I'd been avoiding for 5 years was being forced upon me: continue living the lie and lose my family, or tell the truth and risk destroying their faith in everything they thought they knew about me. That night, flying back to Washington for the NSC briefing, I made a decision that would change everything. It was time to stop hiding. But first, I had to figure out how to reveal a truth so far from their understanding that they might never believe it. The next morning, standing in the White House Situation Room presenting my analysis of the kidnapping network to some of the most powerful people in the American government, I realized something fundamental had shifted. I wasn't just hiding my work from my family anymore. I was hiding my family from my work. And that couldn't continue. 3 months after my father's ultimatum, the invitation arrived that would force everything into the open. Carmen was getting married to David, a commercial banker she'd been dating for 2 years, and she wanted a family celebration that included everyone. Despite the tension with my parents, she insisted I attend the engagement dinner. "I don't care what's going on between you and Dad," she said during a tearful phone call. "You're my sister, and I need you there." The dinner was scheduled for Saturday evening at Romano's, the upscale Italian restaurant where our family had celebrated every major milestone for the past 15 years. The same place where Diego's law school graduation had been toasted, where my parents' 25th anniversary had been commemorated, where I'd never been the guest of honor. I almost didn't go. The classified project I was leading had reached a critical phase, with intelligence suggesting an imminent threat that required round-the-clock monitoring. But Carmen's voice on that phone call, broken with disappointment and desperate for normalcy, convinced me that some obligations transcended professional duty. What I didn't know was that my attendance would intersect with an unschedulable event that would shatter the careful boundaries I'd maintained for years. The evening began exactly as I'd expected. I arrived at Romano's to find my extended family already gathered around the large corner table, champagne glasses raised in celebration. Carmen glowed with happiness while David, nervous but beaming, accepted congratulations from uncles who'd known him since childhood. I slipped into my seat between my mother and Aunt Rosa, offering polite smiles and appropriate enthusiasm for the engagement story. My father nodded curtly from across the table, maintaining the cool distance that had characterized our relationship since our confrontation 3 months earlier. For 45 minutes, I played my part perfectly. I asked about wedding plans, complimented Carmen's ring, and listened to family gossip with the appearance of genuine interest. My phone, set to silent but visible in my peripheral vision, remained mercifully quiet. Then, at 8:17 p.m., everything changed. The first sign of trouble was the sudden arrival of Marcus's date, Jennifer, who burst through the restaurant's front door with the frantic energy of someone bearing urgent news. She was breathless, still clutching her car keys, and her face carried the particular expression of someone who'd just witnessed something significant. "Marcus," she called out as she approached our table. "There are military vehicles everywhere outside. Black SUVs, official-looking cars with government plates. Something major is happening." The table fell silent. In the background, other restaurant patrons were pulling out their phones, murmuring about unusual activity they'd noticed around downtown Chicago. Someone mentioned seeing helicopters. My own phone chose that moment to vibrate against the table. The caller ID showed a number I recognized immediately. Emergency Operations Center. My stomach dropped as I realized what was happening. The classified threat we'd been monitoring had just become active, and they needed me immediately. But before I could excuse myself to take the call, the restaurant's front door opened again, and 3 men in dark suits entered with the unmistakable bearing of federal agents. They moved with purpose, scanning the dining room until their eyes settled on our table. More specifically, until they settled on me. The lead agent approached our table directly, his expression professional but urgent. The entire restaurant had gone quiet now, conversations dying as patrons watched this unexpected drama unfold. "Miss Rodriguez?" he said, stopping beside my chair. I felt the blood drain from my face. Around the table, my family stared in confusion and a growing alarm. My father's expression shifted from annoyance to concern to something approaching fear. "Yes?" I managed, my voice barely audible. "Ma'am, I'm Agent Thompson with the Secret Service. We need you to come with us immediately. There's been a development in the situation you've been monitoring, and your expertise is required for an emergency briefing." The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to detonate. Secret Service. Emergency briefing. Expertise required. Carmen's champagne glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against her plate with a sound that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent restaurant. Diego's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. My mother gripped the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. But it was my father's reaction that cut deepest. His face cycled through confusion, recognition, and something that looked like betrayal as the implications of what he was witnessing began to sink in. "I'm sorry," Agent Thompson continued, addressing the table with practiced diplomacy, "but this is a matter of national security. Miss Rodriguez needs to come with us now." I stood slowly, my legs unsteady beneath me. The carefully constructed world I'd maintained for years was collapsing in real time, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. "Maya," my father said, his voice hoarse with shock. "What is this? What's happening?" I looked around the table at faces I'd known my entire life, seeing myself reflected in their eyes as a complete stranger. The sister they thought they knew, the daughter they'd worried was failing at life, was being escorted away by federal agents for reasons they couldn't begin to comprehend. "I have to go," I said simply, because there was no explanation I could offer that would make sense at that moment. As Agent Thompson led me toward the exit, I heard the explosion of voices behind me, Carmen calling my name, Diego demanding answers. My father's voice rising above the others. "Someone needs to tell me what the hell is going on." But we were already at the door, moving toward the black SUV that would take me to a classified briefing about a terrorist threat that could affect thousands of lives. The work I'd hidden from them for years was demanding everything, right in front of their eyes. The ride to the federal building was silent, except for Agent Thompson's brief explanation of the crisis. The threat we'd been monitoring had accelerated beyond all projections. Intelligence indicated an imminent attack on a major American city, and the analysis I'd been developing was critical to the response effort. Within an hour, I was standing in a secure conference room, surrounded by officials from every major intelligence agency, briefing them on patterns I'd identified that could prevent a catastrophic terrorist attack. The work was crucial, the stakes enormous, and my analysis would directly influence the deployment of resources that could save thousands of lives. But all I could think about was the look on my father's face as federal agents escorted his daughter away from a family dinner to handle matters of national security. The operation was successful. The threat was neutralized before it could materialize, thanks in large part to intelligence analysis that identified the attacker's methodology and likely targets. It was the kind of victory that would never make the news, but it represented the highest achievement of my professional career. When I finally returned home at 4 a.m., exhausted but vindicated, there were 17 missed calls on my personal phone. Voicemails from Carmen, text messages from Diego, and a single message from my father that contained only 4 words: "We need to talk." The family dinner where they'd called me a failure was less than 12 hours away. But now, instead of hiding my truth, I would have to explain it to people who'd just discovered that everything they thought they knew about me was wrong. The family meeting my father demanded took place the next evening in the same dining room where this entire story began. But instead of the celebratory atmosphere of Carmen's engagement dinner, the mahogany table now felt like a tribunal. They sat in a semicircle facing me, my parents, Diego, Carmen, and even Uncle Roberto, who'd driven in from Milwaukee after hearing about the previous night's events. I'd spent the day preparing for this conversation the same way I prepared for classified briefings, with detailed talking points, supporting evidence, and contingency plans for every possible reaction. But sitting across from my family, I realized that all the preparation in the world couldn't bridge the gap between who they thought I was and who I'd actually become. My father spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated confusion and betrayal. "Maya, before you say anything, I need you to understand what last night looked like from our perspective. Federal agents walked into a restaurant, called you by name, and escorted you away for reasons involving national security. Your mother spent the entire night convinced you were either a criminal or a victim of some elaborate con game." I looked at my mother, whose face was drawn with exhaustion and worry. She'd been crying. I could see the remnants of tears in her reddened eyes. The woman who'd raised me to be practical and safe was confronting the possibility that her daughter had been living a life she couldn't even comprehend. "Start from the beginning," Diego said, his lawyer instincts taking over. "What exactly do you do for work? And please, for once, tell us the truth." Quote, I took a deep breath and began with the only truth that mattered. "My name is Maya Rodriguez, and I'm a senior intelligence analyst with Strategic Analysis International, which is a government contractor that provides analytical support to various federal agencies. For the past 7 years, I've been working on projects involving threat assessment, counterterrorism analysis, and national security intelligence." The silence that followed was deafening. Carmen's hand flew to her mouth, Uncle Roberto leaned back in his chair as if I'd physically pushed him. My father's expressions cycled through disbelief, recognition, and something that might have been pride before settling on confusion. Intelligence analyst, my mother repeated slowly, as if testing the words. Like, spy work? Not exactly, I said, choosing my words carefully. I analyze information and provide assessments to help government officials make informed decisions about threats to American interests. I don't collect intelligence in the field, but I help determine what intelligence means and how we should respond to it. The business consulting, Diego said, understanding dawning in his voice. That was all. A cover story, I finished. My real work is classified. I couldn't tell you what I actually did, because most of it involves information that's protected by federal law. But yes, I've been lying to you about my career for 7 years. The word lying hung in the air like an accusation. My father leaned forward, his business instincts engaging as he tried to process this information. Let me understand this, he said slowly. When you told us you were doing marketing research for corporations, you were actually analyzing terrorist financing networks, I said. When I told you I was traveling for client meetings, I was actually briefing government officials about emerging threats. When I said I couldn't discuss my work because of client confidentiality, it was actually because everything I do requires security clearances that prevent me from sharing details with anyone who isn't authorized to know them. Carmen found her voice first. Maya, the agents last night, they said it was a matter of national security. What happened? I considered how much I could reveal without violating classification protocols. There was a credible threat against an American city. The analysis I'd been working on helped identify how the attack would likely be carried out and where it would happen. The information I provided helped prevent something that could have killed thousands of people. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different. Instead of confusion and fear, I sensed something closer to awe. Thousands of people, my mother whispered. The work I do, I continued, it doesn't make headlines when it succeeds. The best intelligence operations are the ones where nothing happens because we prevented it from happening. Last night was one of those successes. Uncle Roberto was the first to recover from the shock. Maya, if this is true, if you've been doing this level of work, why didn't you ever tell us? The question I'd been dreading finally came, and I found myself answering with an honesty that surprised even me. Because you wouldn't have believed me, I said simply, and because I was afraid that if you knew the truth, you'd worry constantly about my safety. But mostly because I convinced myself that your approval wasn't worth compromising work that actually mattered. My father winced at that last statement, and I immediately regretted the harshness of it. That came out wrong, I said quickly. What I mean is, I was afraid that if I told you the truth and you disapproved, I'd have to choose between my family and my calling. So I chose deception instead, which was cowardly. Maya, my father said, his voice softer than I'd heard it in years. Do you remember when you were 8 years old and I found you in my office trying to decode those training manuals? I nodded, the memory still sharp after all these years. I told you that you were born with the wrong instincts, that you were wasting time pretending to belong where you didn't. He paused, running his hand through his graying hair. I was wrong. You weren't pretending to belong somewhere you didn't. You were preparing for somewhere you did. The words hit me like a physical blow. This man who'd spent my childhood dismissing my interests was finally acknowledging that maybe, just maybe, I'd known something about myself that he hadn't been able to see. But why keep it secret for so long? Carmen asked. We're your family. We love you regardless of what you do for work. Because, I said, my voice catching slightly, every time I tried to share my interests as a child, they were dismissed as impractical. Every time I mentioned wanting to work in government or international affairs, I was told it wasn't realistic for someone like me. So I learned to hide the parts of myself that you didn't understand. Diego leaned forward, his expression serious. Maya, the way you've been living, maintaining this level of deception for years, that couldn't have been easy. It wasn't, I admitted. There were times when I desperately wanted to share my work with you. When I helped prevent major attacks, when my analysis influenced policy decisions, when I briefed senior government officials. I wanted to celebrate those victories with my family. But I couldn't, so I celebrated with them alone. My mother stood up suddenly, crossing to where I sat, and pulling me into a fierce hug that spoke of years of misunderstood worry and misdirected love. "I'm sorry," she whispered against my hair. "I'm sorry we made you feel like you had to hide who you were." One by one, my family members stood and embraced me. Diego clasped my shoulder with genuine respect. Carmen hugged me tightly, whispering that she was proud of me. Even Uncle Roberto, overwhelmed by the revelation, managed a handshake that felt like acceptance. But it was my father's reaction that mattered most. He approached me last, his expression complex with emotions I couldn't fully read. "Maya," he said, extending his hand formally, "I owe you an apology that's about 15 years overdue, and I owe you recognition for achievements I never knew to acknowledge." Instead of shaking his hand, I stood and hugged him, feeling years of tension finally release. "There's something else," I said, stepping back to address the entire family. "The work I do, it's not just a job for me, it's who I am. And while I can't share details about specific operations, I don't want to hide from you anymore. I want you to know that your daughter, your sister, does work that matters on a scale you might not be able to imagine." "We want to know," my father said firmly. "Whatever you can share, whatever you're allowed to tell us, we want to understand your life." 3 hours later, after I'd explained as much as classification rules allowed about my career, my training, and the importance of the work I did, we were still sitting around that same mahogany table. But everything had changed. They asked intelligent questions about geopolitics and threat assessment. They wanted to understand how intelligence analysis worked, what kinds of patterns I looked for, how my recommendations influenced government decisions. For the first time in my adult life, my family was genuinely interested in the work that defined me. "There's one more thing," Carmen said as the evening wound down. "My wedding is in 3 months, and I want you to know that when people ask what my sister does for work, I'm going to tell them you're one of the people who keeps our country safe." 6 months later, I stood in the same restaurant where my cover had been blown, this time for a celebration dinner, honoring my promotion to Deputy Director of Intelligence Analysis at Strategic Analysis International. The table was full of family members who now understood, at least in general terms, what their daughter and sister actually did for work. When my father stood to offer a toast, his words carried a weight I'd never heard before. "To Maya," he said, raising his glass, "who saw possibilities the rest of us couldn't imagine, and who had the courage to pursue them even when we couldn't support what we didn't understand. We're proud of the woman you've become, and we're honored to finally know who you really are." As glasses clinked around the table, I realized that the family dinner where they'd called me a failure had led to something unexpected. The family dinner where they finally celebrated my success. Not because my work had become more acceptable to them, but because I'd finally found the courage to be authentic about who I'd always been. The girl who'd played with maps and codes in her bedroom had grown up to be exactly who she was meant to be. And finally, she had a family who could see her clearly. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.